It's not sustainable.
All right, I'll come to you, Collins, but please, a quick one, a bit away from our discussion. It's quite related because you mentioned Nkrumah, and you know, a lot of Nkrumah lovers also around here. So AK Mensah, one of them, I'm sure he would not mind I say that. He said, can Akosua expand further on the part where she says Nkrumah wanted to make himself president for life? I mean, we've also heard this, that this was the reasoning or part of the reasons why, you know, the coup, the first coup in Ghana happened in 1966. But on what basis do you say that Nkrumah wanted to make himself president for life? Could you please unmute your mic?
Oh, I'm sorry. AK, you're a good reader. You can go and read about how Nkrumah was bringing one-party system, okay? It is no secret, and because again, you know that Nkrumah is a darling of many Guineans, so they kind of take things personal, not you per se, okay? But perhaps people feel passionate about him, so they don't want to look at the truth. The fact of the matter is he was a human rights abuser. The economy was not going well by the mid-1960s. So a combination of economy not going well, corruption was in his government. He also suppressed opposition and voices of dissent. He jailed many voices of dissent. So all of these coming together with the fact that he wanted to make himself president for life, it's no secret. And it is there, his one-party system he was engineering. So it is there for us all to read it. So again, I think part of it is because I think Guineans, many of his supporters only focus on he built a factory, he did this, and he had all these policies, but he was a socialist leaning. And no offense, I mean, that's the philosophy, and there's a theory that Westerners and what have you, yes, it could be an element, but the fact of the matter is his economy was starting to run into trouble. His social agenda, he couldn't carry some of them because of economic problems. Their numbers were starting to decline. Most of the factories were starting to have problems. Monies were drying up. And then he was also jailing a lot of the opposition. And that definitely also could have triggered the coup. So the coup didn't come out of nothing.
All right, quick one, just the last one, then I come to Collins, because there's also another question related here. And I'm sure the Nkrumah debate, we would have it one day soon. Now, what's your opinion? Because there's a question here says, does Africa actually need democracy, or better put, is democracy the way to go in the continent? I also asked this question, and I want to add more to it, that we've given some few examples here already. We might describe their regime as benevolent, autocratic system, like the case of Rwanda, or you can even talk about the case of Gaddafi, or even Nkrumah in the 60s, if we would call it that way. But is it not striking that in all these instances, things were going well? And so do you think we really need democracy? Because we've been practicing it, some would say, for not so long in comparison to the West. And like Colin said, in this current dispensation, it is the failure of democracy that is making us see a lot of coups now. So do you think that we really need democracy in the continent?
A few parts to this question. Things were going well. I don't think things were going that well, okay? I think that because, for example, for Dr. Nkrumah, for example, because things were truncated, people think if he was there, things could have gone better. But the fact is, as I said before, anybody can go back and look at the numbers. The economy had already started to suffer. Keep in mind also, typically when countries are given independence, they're given monies, okay, to start with. So he is probably, if you do a comparison, he was probably people that got independence for one. Many of them, because they sought independence, there was public support for them. There's this sentiment towards them. So they were definitely the favorite. Number two, they were often given monies to start with. His money was starting to dry up. That's the fact on the ground. The economy was starting to suffer, but because he was actually disposed or deposed or what have you, people think he could have done better. So good is subjective. Libya, for example, I'm actually doing my thesis on Libya, not so much on the politics of it, more around a few political stuff that's happening. Fact of the matter is there was a lot of corruption in Gaddafi's government, okay? A lot of corruption. He was still colluding with the West to steal from his people. The only thing is, perhaps when he got the money, some of it he used it towards some social programs. And sometimes that's to actually discourage people from overthrowing them. It's almost like we call it appeasement or placation, like making the people happy so they don't overthrow you. So again, it depends on what you think about making things better. Your other side of the question is democracy failing. In fact, Guinea, Chad, and all those places that have actually experienced democracy, they didn't actually have time to nurture their democracy. The people after independence, in fact, the countries that are doing well, countries like Ghana are doing better than these countries you're talking about. Guinea is still one of the poorest, so they're not doing well. Mali is one of the poorest and one of the most corrupt. And they have been, the leaders were still military people who were in power. There's many African countries with colony. So it is not necessarily true that democracy itself is the one that is actually letting them not perform. The countries that have actually started to build democracy, like Botswana, as well as Ghana, there are the countries that are actually seen as, despite their problems, doing better than these other countries, Guinea and those other ones. Does Africa need democracy? I think people think our way out is still democracy, because 72% of Africans would like democracy as opposed to dictatorship, because they've experienced their dictatorship, their enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, a lot of human rights abuses, and you cannot even speak up. So many African countries actually prefer, surveys as a survey actually say many African countries, it actually has declined a bit since 2012, I believe. It used to be 72%. Recently, that was around 69%. So the majority of Africans, the fact that we speak up, the fact that we are able to speak against the government, many people prefer democracy. Probably the manner in which it is happening doesn't actually deliver the result they want, and then researchers also think the manner in which democracy was implemented is part of the problem. Again, still keeping the elite and actually setting structures that don't work for the African countries. People think perhaps democracy should be actually building on the African institutions that were there prior to independence, i.e., and I believe Mauritius and Botswana, which are some of the most solidified democracies, actually also economically doing well, educationally doing well, socially doing better, have high GDP or GNP per capita, better social quality of life. Those countries have actually built on the African system, i.e. consensus building, consensus type of democracy. They've actually also incorporated some of the other institutions. So again, democracy in itself, Africans do like it. I think part of the reason some people think it is bad is because they feel the leaders they have voted haven't delivered economic progress. And I think once the economic progress begin to be delivered, once they can trust the system to change power, then they will begin to actually trust it. It's the format and the manifestation. I think that's why. That's my.
Thank you very much, Akosia. That's very deep. I guess we could also have a discussion around democracy and development, whether that is what has propelled our development or not. Collins, so I know you've been waiting for quite some time now. Pretty much similar question. Akosia avoided, a yes or a no answer. But for you, do you, especially because you made that point of failure in our democracy, which has warranted a number of coups in recent times. And then, so on that basis, is it fair to say that then we have good coups once it's done to save democracy?
Thank you very much, Dr. Apia. I mean, for me, I'm always very careful of, buying into the Western narratives when it comes to certain issues. Because just like Akosia is making excuses for the failure of democracy, I mean, we need to be careful around this narrative, and that is the only way we are going to salvage Africa. I mean, let me go down the history line again. If you look at Southeastern Asia, most of the countries that moved from third world to first world countries, South Korea, these things were not done by a democrat. Today, China is not a democracy, but we know their economic system. So these things, if the democracy we have in Africa have not been able to eliminate poverty, mismanagement, and corruption, which are the promises of why this democracy is sold to us, then we need to, renegotiate these terms. So now coming to your question concerning Coup. Yes, I believe, some coups should be justified. There are good coups actually. In fact, one of the best government Africa have experienced, the government of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, came through coup d'etat. Between 1983 to 1987, we saw what Sankara did in Burkina Faso. Until today, it beats many of the so-called democratic governments we have. So for you to justify a coup d'etat and to engage whether it is a good coup or a bad coup, we need to first of all look at who was overthrown and who is coming in. And lastly, whose interest is protected. Sometimes I used to joke with my friend that whenever I see a coup d'etat and the Western media is up in flames, I say, oh, this is a good coup. But when they are, because when you look at the double standard of the West, you have to understand that Africa is in trouble. I mean, over the years, we know that many Western countries some Western countries or the so-called protectors of democracy have all around the world overthrown a democratic government just to serve their interests. So we need to be careful of the coup because look, for instance, in some countries, you cannot remove certain governments that have transformed into a regime, certain democratic governments that have transformed into a regime. You cannot remove them again by, what I would call legality. These guys have really killed power sharing. They have really messed up with the judiciary, messed up with the legislator, form a kind of what I would call they have concentrated power towards them. You understand? So in this case, how can you remove these guys? They conduct sham referendum, they conduct sham elections, and perpetuate themselves in power. So in this context, like I said, for you to look at what a good coup is actually represents, look at who was overthrown and who is coming in. Because when you have the so-called democratic government muzzling the press, imprisoning opposition leaders, and the poverty, corruption, and mismanagement, which are actually the promises of democracy, are still not eliminated, then you cannot tell me that democracy is better than other forms of government. So in this case, we studying in the West as sometimes we fall into what they sell to us. But we start being African. And coming to Nkrumah, I mean, we also have to look at certain things that concerns Nkrumah's government. At that point, Nkrumah took power in the middle of a Cold War, like I said. And just like Thomas Sankara said, I don't think that these guys got money per se, because if not, why was Sankara fighting? How can you colonize us and at the end of the day, you told us that we are indebted to you? It was part of the reason that Sankara was eliminated. So even if they got money, who is actually controlling the government and who wants their bidding to be done? We know that these colonial masters left us politically, but they did not leave us economically. And we have cases where, because of your policies that they don't like, they sabotage your economy. The popular Julius Nyerere once said that, I mean, in boxing, for example, there's what they call the lightweight, the heavyweight, and the middleweight. And these three boxing categories are professionals. So you cannot expect a new Ghana to compete favorably in the globalized world then with colonial masters like the US, then the British, and all those Western powers. So we have to look at these factors because they are complex, and not be wary of falling into what the description of our leaders that there was the stories that were told by the West. Lee Kuan Yew that transformed Singapore. Singapore was a one-party state. So one-party state is not really a problem if it is all-inclusive. Let me give you an instance. When Singapore came, Malaysia, when Lee Kuan Yew came to power in Singapore, the Singaporean society is made up of three ethnic groups: the Malays, the Chinese, and the Indians. And Lee Kuan Yew is from the dominant ethnic group, which is the Chinese. but he found a way to, to devise things to carry other people along. You understand? And these are the things that made him to work. And even though it was a one-party state, I mean, he was able to move Singapore. As of 1990, Singapore had moved from third world to first world. So instead of being keen on grasping or holding this should be this, we should look at the impact of this government on the people. You cannot tell me that democracy should be upheld and all those things when we are not seeing the promises. And just like the excuses we make for certain things like religion, we keep on making they are not practicing this well. Let us just call a spade a spade. When democracy fails, let us admit and look at, yes, this thing is not that all perfect. But even at that, how can you? Democracy have to work with a lot of things, including literacy. And now you tell me it's one man, one vote in a country like Nigeria, where someone that doesn't even know why he is voting will have one vote to me. So sometimes I believe that if people that are, let me use the word benevolent enough to capture the state and close up the state and develop it to a certain level of time, if this thing is actually reflecting on the society and we know the indicators, for example, we look at, I'm not making excuses for Kagame or whatever, but there are indicators in this present world that we judge whether a society is working or not. Look at the Human Development Index, for example. How are those countries faring there? What is the literacy level? And other things. Then it doesn't matter if the system is democratic or not. Yeah, when we come to human rights abuses, let us also know that this Western narrative that is always pushing it are also double standard. Look at what happened with Khashoggi that was murdered in Turkey by the Saudi government. I mean, US and Saudi, US is one of the biggest allies of Saudi Arabia. And the same reason of human rights abuse they cited in one of the things they invaded Gaddafi and they finished off the economy of Mugabe. What is happening in Saudi Arabia? So we need to be careful, I mean, whose narrative we are buying into in all those things. So to me, to finalize, yes, some cues are actually good and can be justified. Thank you.
Wow, very interesting there. Thank you very much, Collins. I have a few questions here for you, also some few follow-up questions. I think because of our time, I probably would later come to you. I would allow you to react, Akosia, and then perhaps also ask my very final question on the way forward to address this. But Collins, you have looked, you said yes, emphatically there could be a good coup.
Yeah,
and
sure.
you are saying that this should be measured on certain two dimensions, which is who they overthrew and then the interest that they serve. But
Yeah,
my question is, so what happens if, for example, they overthrew a dictator, or in the case of, let's use Guinea, the case of Alpha Conde, who was recently, I mean, yeah, we agree, he subverted the constitution, whether through a referendum or whatever. He's been overthrown. So this is the interest of the people. We saw the people jubilating. But what happens if now the strong man in Guinea, as is now referred to, also decides to capture power because power sweets? And would then that be classified as a good coup? On what basis are we sure that these military men are going to hand over power easily and are even going to help develop the country? Because in the past, we've seen a lot of military coups that came on the basis of there's a corruption, there is this, but we saw they did worse instances. So what do you say to that? If at the end of the day, they take your first two boxes, which is they overthrew a bad person, it was in the interest of the people, but they end up being bad.
Thank you very much. To answer your question, first of all, like we said, I mean, it is the failure of democracy that led to the coup d'etat in the first place. And now, when this government, like we have with the case of Alpha Conde, when they already thwarted the constitution and put the country to a political instability, is already unconstitutional. So what is a coup? An unconstitutional takeover of government or attempt to take over a government. So when you've already done that in a democratic setting, what moral justification? Now looking at the way how to checkmate these guys that come in. I mean, there are a lot of checks and balances, just like democracy is not perfect. I mean, military government, most military government, like you said, have been disastrous. But that doesn't mean that I will apply the council culture, on military regimes. Like I cited Sankara, that most of them is bad. and is also what is like, we can also call, call out a considerable amount in a democratic government. Yeah, because as far as I'm concerned, there is no democratic government in Africa at the moment. We can look at, consider some that are semi-democratic, but look deep also, you will see that there are still human rights and the muzzling of opposition. So to answer your question, we have ECOWAS and we have the African Union. These guys make sure. My only problem is that they said make sure to transfer to a civilian rule. To me, I think that should be make sure that let's see your step in towards building an institution. Let us look at how your takeover is reflecting on the people. You understand? Because we shouldn't be quick to say, oh, civilian rule is better or democracy is better, when we are not seeing it on the lives of the people being governed. So we know how to measure this, and we have checkmates like ECOWAS, the African Union, which already has sanctioned the Guinea. The ECOWAS has already sanctioned Guinea. So in this case, we have to look at the institutions and what they have in place, you know. And when they're not doing well, people, believe me, most of the uprising we saw in Sudan are just people oriented. We'll see the way people will see handle it. So let us just circle these things around people. Even civilians are also guilty of whatever you are accusing the military. So I think that should be my answer.
All right, thank you very much. And maybe I also would like to add that I recently watched a documentary about one of our coup makers, one Ignatius Coutu, a champion, and I'm told he was also the documentary seems to suggest that he's one of our best presidents in terms of, you know, success with development and the stuffs. They've written a book about him, and I'm here to read, just to buttress what you said about Thomas Sankara. And I know you're a huge fan of Thomas Sankara when it comes to politics in Africa. So some few messages on Facebook that seems to support your stance, Collins, mostly from AK Mensa. I think I disagree with Akosua that the media is censored and human rights are abused by Kagame. In Singapore, there are equally such abuses by the government against young protesters. What a country needs is our own democracy carved to suit our cultural needs. If people of Rwanda are happy and there is growth and development, and all that what should matter? I'll ask your reaction, Akosua. Perhaps we are too young and we don't know, we didn't experience the past. That's why we speak this way. And then Albert says, I agree with Collins to an extent. Take China, for instance. Since 1990, China has been able to lift over 800 million of her people out of poverty due to the country's economic reforms. Mo Ibrahim Index of Good Governance argues that Ghana is among the most 10 countries that have deteriorated economically within the last 10 years. Well, anyway, but there's a question here before I come to you, Akosua. It's the same question by Samson on Zoom that says, please, is it that we Africans don't understand democracy, or democracy is not made for we the African? Maybe Collins, you first, because your views for me seems to suggest that when there's the need to have a coup, we should go for it if the democracy is not working. And perhaps if democracy is working, we should allow it. You feel that we do not understand democracy, or democracy was just not made for us, so we should go back to an autocratic regime?
Thank you very much. For me, I wouldn't say that, because one of the oldest democratic society that have been found in the world is in Africa, precisely the Igbo people. I'm from the Igbo ethnic group of Nigeria. And in fact, part of the reason why the indirect rule did not work during the colonial times is because we are democratic in nature. We don't have kings. I mean, for the Igbo society then, we have the ancient, it was one of the oldest societies that gave women role that people will call Omada. The Omada was very actively involved in the governing affairs of the society. And we have the Indians and also, and the other things. So in fact, our democratic system was even copied or invaded. So nobody can say it's not that we don't understand democracy. That should be wrong notion. But the thing is that, is the liberal Western style of democracy favorable to us? Are there things we need to put in place before we can practice that they are not telling us and making excuse for the failures of democracy? Like I gave an example before, democracy works with literacy. Imagine that you're having a one vote, for example, in the style in Nigeria, for example, one man, one vote. I guess it should also be the same in Ghana. Once you're 18 years in Nigeria, you have to vote. Even when you have little or no education, some people have been interviewed in polling units and they don't even know what they're expecting from the incoming government. So these are the weaknesses we have with democracy. So at the point, I mean, in every society, there are the thinkers and there are the enjoyment, permit me to use those words. So in sometimes, if we build those institutions, at a point, some societies have the so-called strong men. And let us always identify that these societies we are copying today, like for example, America went into a civil war as far back as in 1770 something or whatever. So today, let's not just be quick to judge us and all those things. The thing we should be asking is, how far have we gone? Which stage are we in now? We need strong men sometimes to build strong institutions. Then when these strong institutions are there, at some point, democracy can take place. In the case of Lee Kuan Yew, because I only like citing Singapore, which is still like open. Lee Kuan Yew was there for almost 3 decades. And he tried to strengthen the Singaporean institutions. So at the point now, his son is there today. And some people, had it been it was in African countries, some people will say, oh, it's an elite capture and all those things. But what we are looking at, how is Singapore doing with the Human Development Index? How are they doing in the last in the global context as well? You will know that they are doing fine. So the problem shouldn't be what they are really forcing us or some ideologies. The problem should always be, and the focus should always be on the people. So that's my take on this.
All right, thank you very much. And I think it's pretty much the same position that Albert also posted, that one, what a country needs is our own democracy carved to suit our cultural needs. And your last statement also corroborates what he wrote earlier on, and that's the question for Akosua. So if you listen to Collins and Albert, they are saying if people are happy and there is growth and development, that's all that matters. And so that even if human rights are being abused, I'm not saying that's what they said, but you could, draw some inference from that, that once there is economic growth, why should we be bothered?
It depends on how you measure happiness, and happiness is subjective. And I'm not so sure whether, because either Collins or not to put you both on the spot, but both of you are not talking from the countries that you're praising. You don't live there. So maybe if you live there under those suppressions, whereby even academic freedom may be suppressed, maybe you would have a different opinion. You may not be able to, because go to Rwanda, even in the internet is censored. Even academic freedom is quite suppressed. And from what I understand, even there are allegations of massaging numbers, okay? And the Kagame government has had to revise certain numbers actually because of the way they sort of influence what gets published and what doesn't. So again, we could talk from afar and make a judgment. And again, so then are we equating everything, all as long as it's about development and people have employment, that's all life is about, okay? So quality of life and development, so it's because maybe when people are looking at economic development as they have a job or something, but quite frankly, Rwanda has 39% poverty rate, okay? So let's put it aside. Also, in general, many African countries are not even democratic. So to blame lack of development on democracy, it is unjustified. Also, keep in mind, a lot of factors go into development. Africa has one of the youngest population in the whole world. The median population is 20 years old. And so when we have people giving birth at a rate which is actually surpassing the development growth, that could also affect how many people get employed. In Nigeria, 1 in 3 people, or especially the youth, are unemployed. South Africa, which is Nigeria, by the way, is the largest economy in West Africa. And these days, even actually in the entire African continent. South Africa is supposed to be the most industrialized, and they also have an unemployment rate. The countries that are experiencing coup in Africa, many of them are not actually democratic. If you look at Guinea, they only had Mr. Condé for 2 terms, which is 10 years. So the 10 years since independence, the people that are there, coup d'etat, they came in and they were there. So since 1958, they got independence for the whole period. 10 years of democracy couldn't transform the country, therefore it's democracy that didn't develop the country. In my mind, that's very simplistic, a simplistic way of looking at things. Yes, I do agree that some level of stability and continuity actually brings development. However, many of these African countries, even Ghana, which is seen as one of the most democratic, they've only had democracy for less than 30 years. And Ghana is not the most poorest. In fact, the most advanced countries in Africa are the most democratic, which is Botswana, Mauritius, as well as I forgot the other one. They have better GDP, they have better literacy rate, and they are one of the most democratic. And when I'm talking about democratic, I didn't necessarily say, I had already, keep in mind, I had already said, these are the countries that have successful democracy, where the people are much more literate, where the people are have a better quality of life, better GNP. Those actually incorporated African institutions. That's what I said earlier. And so I didn't advocate for such and such. And Singapore, by the way, is known as a nanny state. So yes, they may have high economic numbers, but there's a lot of restrictions in those countries. And I also did not justify human rights abuses in these other countries. Neither did I justify Western intervention. All I'm saying is, I do not think it is fair to necessarily blame the African underdevelopment solely on democracy that has actually just been instituted just for about 20 years. When you look at Botswana, they've actually had democracy right after independence, and they incorporated their chieftaincy into their and many other African institutions. And when Collins talked about Igbos and democracy, yes, he is right. And actually Botswana also was one of those. The Akan tradition also had one of those. But those kinds of democratic institutions actually had consensus building. It is not so much the Western adversarial type. So when I'm talking about democracy, I'm not necessarily, it depends on how you see it. What I'm saying is, you cannot blame the underdevelopment and resentment solely on institution of democracy. It is how that was implemented, the conditions under which it was implemented, and the manner in which it is manifested. They're actually juxtaposed, like they're transposed on Western systems, structures that when I started earlier, I said is actually colonial. So it's a colonial institution, elitism, colonial education, colonial structures that favor certain people. That is what their current democracies are actually transposed upon. And the structures being used, many of them are Western, and that is part of the thing we're having problems. So when you also see, I find it also contradictory when people are complaining about somebody extending the term to stay, and at the same time they're advocating for a leader to continue on because they think one person continue on is justified. Then I don't know where they stand, because then are you advocating for continuity, or how do you choose that leader? And what is the guarantee that a person committing the coup is gonna be like, at least the Kagames you want? What's the guarantee? Many African countries are not democratic and they have dictators. So you can't pick one of the 54 countries and one became seemingly successful and claim that is actually the way to go. Also, once there is a coup in one country, there is more coups. So then Sankara didn't last. So he may have been a good leader, but that shows you it is not sustainable. Once he paved the way, then other people would also overthrow you, even though you might seem to be a good one. The same way Nkrumah did not last, because again, it is not sustainable. If you begin to suppress, some people will also overthrow you. So it's not gonna last. It doesn't matter how you feel towards the person. They could have been good or whatever, but people would also overthrow you. So then maybe we have to look at how do we make it sustainable, and how do we ensure the person being there is actually going to deliver as you wish.
Great. That's a very last ending there. And also just to add that it's also true that even the example I gave about Ignatius Kutuye-Champon, he also did not last, because then even though he was doing well, you know, when you look at some of the new documentaries that I said I just watched. Just to buttress what you said, Edmond has this to say. What we have in Africa now is half-baked democracy. We have not built the institutions, therefore it is not fair assessment. We can only judge the efficacy if we build governance around institutions and not people and identity. So I think that the discussion has been interesting so far. As also one commenter here on Zoom from Esther says, interesting discussion. Albert keeps pushing issues around Rwanda and the likes, but I think our time will not permit me to read it. But I like how you ended up with that. So what's the way forward? How can we, and I even like the one thing that I picked from your ending is, and also I'm sure Collins also would agree that if there is a good coup, how do we make sure that that's even sustainable in the first place? But bottom line, my general question, which will be my last question, our time is up. We've been giving additional questions, but I think we can use this for just the very last question. What can we do to stop coup in Africa? What can governments do to stop coup in Africa? Or for Collins only, if it's a good coup, how do we make sure that it's sustainable? You know, it's indeed becomes a good coup. I'll start with you, Akosua. Generally, if you can do this in 5 minutes for me, then Collins would also take 5 minutes. Then I read some more messages and then we can go. What can governments do to stop coup in Africa?
I think there's a feeling that the only people that can actually stop this kind of domino, because again, once you do the coup, so you may have your leader, but it will not last, because once you pave the way, other people will also overthrow you. So again, it's not sustainable and it's not realistic to expect that that is coup. And coup is a sign of instability, okay? And then what happens is, once you have the coup, and then there's a sense of unpredictability of it. And so because there's unpredictability, that discourages investors, that even entrepreneurs, because how do you know next person is not going to be overthrown, even if you have a good person there? So again, because of that, personally, I don't think it's a good thing. How do we stop it? I think that the consensus, as I said, is their African leaders themselves can stop it. There is the fact that people extend, I think that there's a consensus that extending your terms is in itself subverting the constitution. You yourself, you're breaking the rule. And whether you had a referendum or not, you are disrespecting the process. And so then if somebody else who was before you had changed it, you wouldn't have the chance to be there. So you're there and you want to change it. So to me, that in itself subverted. So people think the African Union, as well as the ECOWAS group, should do something about this when a leader begins to extend it. But there I see, legally I see there's a problem, because the African systems or the African groups actually practice what is called the principle of non-intervention. And so they respect the sovereignty a lot. And I think part of it is because of their colonial history. So because they don't want the Western people to intervene anymore, therefore they try to respect each other. And I also think the other side of it is because they also do the same thing. They feel like if they intervene in another country, they also give a license for another country, if they also do something wrong, for another country to also intervene. Therefore, the African countries typically stay standby when there is something happening in the other country and don't talk about their fellow leader. So it's all like, part of it is protecting them, part of it is protecting themselves, not to open the floodgate for them, for other countries to also interfere. Therefore, they stand by. And I think there's a criticism that that principle has to be probably looked at. So then, if there's a leader that is doing the wrong things, they need to speak up. But is that also political interference, right? Are the people going to be able to agree? I think the people in the countries actually probably have to come together and push their leaders to actually come to this kind of compromise themselves. Because if the people stand by and have a few elite continue to govern, then I'm not so sure how another country or the ECOWAS, because ECOWAS is also, keep in mind, ECOWAS is made up of all these leaders, the same leaders. They make the decisions, they make the ECOWAS constitution and rules. So then the rules are made by the same leaders. So then if the rules don't permit, ECOWAS is only able to act to the extent that the powers are given by the same leaders. So I think when people often criticize ECOWAS, then there's aspect of not really understanding the limitation of the ECOWAS, because ECOWAS's powers are conferred by the leaders themselves, the powers they're given. So ECOWAS cannot do what the leaders have not allowed. So they're limited that way. And there is a question of also the interference, as I talked about, because the people themselves, we hear many Guineans complaining, oh, Nigerians are invading our country and these people are coming into our country and ECOWAS this, and they complain. And I'm sure other countries also complain the same way. So other countries may feel that ECOWAS is imposing. Recently, even in Guinea, I heard Guineans criticizing the ECOWAS leader, who is the president of Ghana, and that they're interfering. So again, they want ECOWAS to do more, but then they also feel ECOWAS is encroaching. So how do we deal with it? Just to simplify your question around how do we stop this? I think that people have to begin to talk. And then when there is a referendum, hopefully they would vote freely. But I think transparency as well as inclusive participation is the way to go. And that is where AK may be advocating for Rwanda and may have his own bias against Rwanda. But I think it is still not fair that 85% of the people are sidelined. It is not right. And if you were in that position, I don't think you'll be happy either, no matter what so-called development they're bringing. And I don't know what that is about they being happy. In general, I feel that inclusion is the way to go, transparency is the way to go, and consensus building, so that people that are chronically eliminated from power, it has to be looked at, because that is what actually causes their resentment and intervention. But more coups bring more coups. So you could have that leader, but then it's not gonna work. But the places of, I don't wanna go on and on, but in places like Singapore and China, we have to look at what agendas they put in place, but it wasn't so much coups. But I think they sort of worked within the elite to pick out somebody who would be effective, whereby in Africa, somebody jumps and summarily, like without any checks and balances, think they themselves are better and they overthrew, and that is subjective. So there's no guarantees there as to whether they're gonna be delivering for you. So it's a different process altogether.
Interesting one there, Akosua. So you say that more coups indeed bring more coups, and one way to deal with it would be to ensure that various governments in Africa ensure transparency, inclusiveness, and of course participation, as well as consensus building. Just to read one message from AK, which I'm sure you would like, because it talks about inclusiveness. So AK says Ghana's parliament is made up of less than 40% inclusion of women. Rwanda has more than 50% women in Paul Kagame's cabinet of ministers. Perhaps this is working in favor of Rwanda. That's why we've not yet seen a coup, because of the inclusiveness. So Collins, what do you also think? What do you think can be done to stop the coup in Africa? Akosua talked about the role of ECOWAS and the AU. I know and she did justice to that, given the situation where they find themselves. In one breath, you have citizens saying, you people should interfere. In another breath, they say, why are you both interfering? Pay attention to your own problems, you know? And people have even called for some form of law or regulation that would have a ceiling on the number of years or number of terms, actually, that a president could be on. I don't know what your take is with that, and generally, what do you think can be done to stop coup?
The subject of interference is sometimes the subject of might is right, because we all know how Gaddafi was invaded with the so-called right to protect. We understand all those things, and we know that there's also some countries that we've seen similar things and they were not also invaded. So, but that's another topic. I think I completely agree, or I agree partially with many of the things Akoso said. My only point of disagreement is just making excuses for the failure of democracy and saying, oh, we are not practicing the real democracy. No, if we can be able to holistically attack authoritarian regimes, then we shouldn't make excuse for democracy. Let us just, agree that there are some weaknesses associated with democracy, and it's not that all perfect the way they are presenting it to us. Now, to answer your question, well, to prevent or to avoid further coup d'etat in Africa, and I wouldn't limit it to military takeover. Also, for the unconstitutional elongation of power by democratic governments that transform themselves into a regime. Then, first of all, we have to look at why are these democracies failing and what is happening with the people. We first of all demilitarize politics, because at the moment you see where a sitting government is using military in all ramifications to muzzle the press, to intimidate the opposition. At a point, you embolden them. They have seen you. Yeah. So we have to, then we also have to create a kind of a reward and punishment system. That one should be done at the regional level with ECOWAS and with African Union, because we've seen in the past where some coups, the body language of the ECOWAS leaders was like more in support, and in other coups, they vehemently oppose it. So when we are clear that, okay, we don't want coup, including the unconstitutional elongation of power by, the so-called civilian government, then we now have a discussion on the table. Also, we have to look at building strong institutions, because that's the only way a country can thrive. That's the only way a country can advance into development, So when you build strong institutions, and we see that the reasons the military always give are the so-called custodians of democracy, as they will call themselves, because when you look at the coup speech, it's always similar. They always cite mismanagement, corruption, poverty. So if these things can be addressed, I believe we can reduce coup d'etat in Africa. Then we also look at the power sharing. It's not the case where the president concentrates all the power there with some few elites, and the parliament is messed up, or the judiciary is the court orders are not obeyed, as we can see in countries, some countries in West Africa and Africa Eastern. All these things need to be addressed. Then capacity building, educate your society. When you have an educated society, democracy thrives. So don't just come and do copy and paste. Germany, for example, have over 98% literacy level, and you're copying and pasting to countries that have less than 50% literacy level. So we need to look at all those things. So for this to avert future coup d'etat, all these things need to be put in place. That most importantly, we need to work together at the regional level. Like I said, the ECOWAS need to take a stance against these things, including the African Union. So I think I would drop with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. So pretty much similar to what Akosia also said, you are calling for things like, avoiding the use of military in politics because it empowers them and they feel that they are indeed the custodians of democracy. And also we should build strong institutions and address development issues, capacity building, and also work on democracy. I think at this point, I would allow one or two questions from our participants from Zoom here. Time is really fast spent. I'm sure that we've had a very interesting discussion. Then I'll just come back to you and allow you to conclude with a concluding remark on what you think is the way forward for African politics and coup. Okay, this perhaps is not a question. I'll swap and allow you, Collins, just to give us your concluding remark in a minute.
Well,
sorry, my attention have been drawn to a question here. From an intellectual point, a question from Clement, from an intellectual point of view, can a mass coup be a possibility to the transformation of the African continent? So I'm not too sure what the mass coup is, but perhaps if the entire, I think Akosia also made a point like that, if the entire citizenry, for example, not necessarily the entire, I'm not sure we'll ever get there, but let's say, I guess if majority of the people feel that, okay, we don't want the president, we just want him to go. And I don't know how that would also work since they have their terms yeah. So could we say that a mass coup is a possibility? Would that also be justified? I'm not too sure in which form. But yeah, if I could hear from you, Collins, what's your take on that? Someone is asking whether a mass coup is the way forward to transform Africa's democracy.
Well, I always said, I mean, the politics, the governance should be about the people. And when the people are not feeling the impact, be it democracy, be it a regime, I mean, you should get out. And coming to the answer, I think he's referring for something like an Arab Spring.
Oh, okay.
When you look at what happened in the Arab Spring, we have certain countries that, like Tunisia, for example, that I don't think that when the president went off, his tenure is already off. But you saw the people, rising up. We also saw that in Sudan. So, most times this military act based on what is popular in the street, what is they are popular, that is popular, the popular opinion among the locals. And in that case, the president have already subverted the rule of law and killed everything democratic in the country. So let's look at people and what happens in the Arab Spring. Maybe the president's tenure is not yet over, but when the people, based on what is happening, maybe the elections was marred by irregularities and the president was sworn in nevertheless. So, and an uprising happens. You see it, people are being cited a lot of things. I think in that context, I wouldn't even call it a coup, but that regime change will be less.
But Collins, is this not a bit dangerous? Because often, so a president is voted, granted, everything is fine, free and fair. He or she has 4 or 5 years, depending on the country in which you are. He or she has spent 2-3 years. His term of office is not yet ended, regardless, even if there's no development. Should this be the way forward? Can't we exercise patience and wait for the next election to vote against the person? Well, is this not, like Akosua said, more coups? And then the next government that comes, people would organize people and say that after 2 years, we think it's not working, so let's do an Arab Spring. Is this not too dangerous?
No. If you listen to me closely, you will say when I said that the president might have subverted or killed the rule of law, like everybody knows that whatever the election wasn't free, fair, and credible. Sometimes you see international observers, attesting to this, but nevertheless, the president was sworn in. So in that case, I guess this is, but everybody knows that when this is just being sponsored by the opposition to tarnish the image of the president. We've seen that, and it has been quelled also. So, but in this case, like the world is watching, the election observers were there, and they attested that this election was not free, fair, and credible. There was a lot of disenfranchisement and all those things. So in that case, I mean, removing the government should be justified. I should count it as a good coup. Thank you.
All right, I get your point. Yeah, I also feel that I'll allow you, Akosua, to have the last bites and then we'll be done. But I also feel that opposition leaders and politicians should also be careful. Sometimes I feel we are too quick to say the president should just step down because he's not performing, And I'm not saying they are usually trivial issues that people are basing on, but I feel sometimes the opposition parties should also be careful, and it's something they do, and it comes back to bite them or hunt them at the end of the day. Akosua, concluding remark, and what do you make of the last question, that whether a mass coup is the way forward or not?
I don't know. I kind of see those uprising as a sign of instability in the first place, right? Yes, even because again, in areas where democracy has solidified, if the people don't like something, they express it and they still want the process. Even if they don't want the leader, they expect the process through the leader to be changed through a process, all right? Whereby I feel, and I still will not blame the underdevelopment of Africa on democracy, because democracy is still very new. So we cannot blame our failures. And there are so many places in the world that are practicing democracy that are not poor. So our problems are much more complex than just blaming it solely on democracy. They are on a lot of things. So just to answer the question first, the person said mass coup or whatever. We've had over 200 coups and still things have not changed. So if you have these many coups in many of these countries, Sudan being the one with the most coup, 15 or so since independence, and Ghana 10, it goes on and on. I kind of posted a little map that shows all these coups around the world. The people that have the most coups, they're the poorest. So I don't know how coup is supposed to be their panacea for development, because the evidence is clear that there's no guarantee that coup is going to make you develop. And by the way, as I said, it's a sign of instability. In terms of the people uprising, I think how that is powerful is then the next leader comes. And then does that also mean that whenever a leader is not right, we take to the street and we just change, or what is that gonna look like? So as a people, when we do one uprising, why can't we do the same uprising to make sure our institutions are actually working and sustainable? Why can't we be orderly as a people? Why do we always have to be impatient that we have to always react in order to have a change effected? So to me, I kind of see that as that in itself, not comes to the question somebody or a comment somebody made about not understanding democracy, because I kind of feel as if that part of the world, people are not even patient about anything. Everything they have to yell and scream, and they think it has to be delivered. My point is still the same. I think the underdevelopment is a number of factors. Colonial mechanism, the trade having changed, democracy or not. And so there are multiple factors impacting on our democracy and on our economies, not just democracy. There are so many factors: ethnic diversity, illiteracy, which Collins had already mentioned. There are so many factors. We give birth too much than our resources can actually compete with. Africa has one of the youngest population. And so many people are always competing for jobs, competing for resources. And many places where people are competing for resources, there is bound to be conflict. So all these factors are part of it. And so and then the colonial things, the trade that doesn't favor us. So there are many more factors impacting on us. Our democracy has not established 100 years to be able to know that we've practiced democracy 100 years to be able to blame their lack of progress on it. Because you cannot, to be able to pinpoint that democracy is the reason we are underdeveloped, where we have corruption, you need to be able to directly link it up. But if you cannot link, and there are many factors, you cannot blame it solely on it. If a country practices democracy for 10 years, I don't know what country developed under 10 years. So to me, we need to develop our structures. We need to identify problems we have in our system as to why, even if we don't like the democracy, what form of government do we want? And how do we want to structure it? To me, that's what the conversation should be about, not just looking at things black and white and say, democracy didn't work. We practiced 10 years, 20 years. Therefore, our development is because of that. The corruptions are based on the structures that favor a certain group of people, the elitism, the political class, their educated class, the security class. These are the people the country rallies around, and those are the people that are governing. And so if we cannot trickle and make the masses of the people benefit from the structures, whether that is democratic state or whether that's a dictatorial state, then it's still, the result is going to be the same. So I don't think it's because of democracy. I actually think it's because of certain structures we haven't looked at to improve. That is what is causing it. And the moment somebody comes into power, we don't see the immediate change, it is because of that person per se. But the structures actually make people corrupt. That is the problem, not the democracy per se. I'm also not saying democracy is perfect. I am just saying it is not solely to be blamed. But that doesn't mean I'm saying it's perfect. And the alternative, as I said, we have many coups and we haven't seen any result of the coup delivering the social change. In summary, I feel most African countries have had the most coups than anywhere else, and they're the poorest. And so the coups have not delivered the social change in the countries that have experienced. Sudan is one of the poorest countries. It is also one of the most corrupt countries, okay, in the world. So Guinea, the same thing, Chad, the same thing, and many of these still had people that were in power 20, 15 years by coup, and they were still corrupt. So to me, we should look at what is it not is working, and how do we sort of involve people? How do we include people in the participation? How do we improve our institutions? How do we make people more literate so they can do informed decisions? How do we spread out and include everybody so then the things are not concentrated? That's what we should be looking at. Not democracy versus autocracy, because autocracy, if somebody is corrupt, then you are even doomed, because you talk about it, you may be disappearing tomorrow. So it's even more dangerous, I think.
Thank you very much, Akosua. That was a great summary. I guess you did my job for me. But to our viewers and our participants here on Zoom, want to say a very big thank you for your time. And of course, to Collins and Akosua, thank you very much. This has been CEPSA Talk. Today we looked at how do we solve Africa's coup conundrum. It's been a very intense discussion throughout. It's pretty much clear that when it comes to coup, two main reasons or two main phases, as I guess described, immediately after independence, that could be blamed more on, you would say, the colonial structures and also international power influence. But of recent, it's more on the issue of democracy failure. But the way forward is not coup, because as Akosua has said, one coup leads to another coup,